"Useless old man. You ran 40 years ago, and today you're still nothing but a coward." That insult, Judge Raymond Lander hurled straight into Walter Grayson's face in the packed courtroom. He slammed his gavel like he wanted to tear the air apart, shouting with the power-drunk tone of someone who believed he stood above other people's lives. And the moment Walter stood up, he leapt down from the bench, grabbed the old man's collar as if he meant to crush both the past and the last breath of a veteran. But, only a few seconds later, all that violence was stopped by one single sentence. Walter lifted his head, looked straight into his eyes, his voice slow, sharp, each word like a cold blade cutting through the room. "Call sign Delphi." The space froze. Heartbeats were louder than the wind hitting the windows. In those few seconds that felt as long as a lifetime, the name buried for 40 years rose back from the dark. Walter was no longer the old man Lander wanted to destroy. He became the living witness of a procedure that buried innocent people, a crime the Lander family thought would rot away with their coffins. If you were Walter Grayson, framed, trampled, stripped of your dignity, pushed into silence for 4 decades, would you stand up, or bow your head and live the rest of your life in fear? If this story makes you stop and think, share it, so more people understand that silence is also a crime. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories that force you to look again at justice, courage, and truth. Early gusts of wind hit hard as thick snow fell over the streets of Cleveland. The city was surrounded by a dense white layer, and passing headlights left smeared streaks across the slick road. Walter Grayson gripped the steering wheel with hands that were slowly losing feeling. 73 years of age weighed on his body like a stone, making each breath heavy. The blood sugar monitor on the passenger seat blinked red. Warning, he was dropping, but he didn't stop. His family member was lying in the intensive care unit. This morning, he needed to get there. Walter lowered the window to get more air. The cold wind, flooding, making him shiver but helping him stay alert. St. Mary's Hospital appeared faint behind the white snow, people hurrying past with their coats pulled tight against the wind hitting their faces. Walter inhaled deeply, trying to steady his heartbeat. When he turned into the parking gate, he loosened his left hand without turning on the signal. That unconscious moment lasted only a few seconds, but the red and blue lights behind him flashed like a sharp point cutting through the mist. The siren made him jump. Walter slowed down, the car sliding slightly on the thin layer of snow. A patrol car drew up on his right. He looked into the rearview mirror and saw the young officer stepping out. He wore a thick coat and a tight hood, his boots pressing into the snow with harsh, dry sounds. He seemed like someone waiting for the smallest mistake to check off another mark of performance. Walter hadn't lowered the window yet when a hard strike on the car door made him recoil. The officer shouted, his loud voice sending a burst of steam into the freezing air. His face was tense, his eyes locked on Walter. Walter fumbled to lower the window. He began, but his voice broke. The officer didn't let him continue. "Put both hands outside." His voice was an order. Walter slowly raised his hands, shaking from the cold and the dropping blood sugar. When he tried to say he was tired and needed to get into the hospital, the officer didn't listen. "Shut up. You're disturbing my duty." He pulled the door open so hard it jerked, grabbing Walter's arm, without caring about the clumsiness of an old, sick man. Walter stepped onto the road, trying to hold the door edge to keep his balance. "I'm trying to explain," he said. His breath floated out in white bursts. The officer stood close to his face, lowering his voice just enough to make it a threat. "You think stuttering a few lines will make me change what I write?" He looked Walter up and down like examining a criminal rather than a sick man standing in a snowstorm. Walter felt his eyes blur, not knowing if it was the wind or the fear creeping into each breath. "I need to go inside. I have someone in the ICU." The officer gave a short, harsh laugh. "Everyone has a reason. I hear these excuses all the time." He took a notebook from his coat, the pen pinched between his fingers, writing each line heavily, as if engraving it on the paper. "Refusing to cooperate, showing resistance, affecting the force." Walter looked at those lines and felt like a stone had been placed on his chest. "I'm short of breath, not disobeying," he said. The officer turned fully toward him, old and still acting. "I'm sick of these tricks." He pressed the button on the body camera, but the red light blinked once and turned off. He looked at it and spoke like it didn't matter. "Device error. Always like that." Walter understood the truth of the last few minutes would not exist anywhere in the record. The officer pushed him against the car, making him almost fall. "One more word and you'll spend a night in holding." Walter pressed his lips together to contain the pain running along his ribs after being shoved. Snowflakes shattered on his shoulders, clinging to his coat until they melted into cold drops. When he regained balance, Walter looked up and saw the officer wearing black gloves scanning the paperwork and underlining a phrase with the pen tip. The stroke was so hard that the paper almost tore. Dangerous resistance. It was a conclusion written from a tiny morning mishap in the snow, recorded as evidence of disturbing order. Walter felt his palm turn ice cold as he signed the report. The pen almost slipped from his trembling fingers. The moment he put it down, everything shifted. This was no longer a traffic mistake. This was a battle beginning with a few strokes of a pen. The police car engine started, its tires crushing the brittle snow with a sharp sound. The officer looked at him through the window and smirked before driving off. Walter stood there, the wind pushing into his collar, his eyes on the wrinkled report shrinking in his hand. The hospital was only a few steps away, yet the thought of walking in with this feeling made his chest heavier. He inhaled, closed his eyes for a few seconds to regain balance in the cutting cold. He knew what was happening wasn't a lone incident. Something was off, a kind of overblown use of authority he had seen from his military days. He felt that same vague tension from old investigations where right and wrong were twisted depending on who held the pen. In another place, not far from the hospital gate, a quiet office with a darkened wooden desk was lit by a desk lamp. A folder was placed neatly on top. The name of the cited person sat on the front page, the letters clear. When the door opened, Judge Raymond Lander stepped in, his coat covered by a thin layer of snow. He removed his gloves, sat down, and opened the file. He read through it once, his eyes moving quickly. When he reached the name Walter Grayson, his gaze stopped. His facial muscles shifted slightly like someone recognizing a name they didn't expect. He leaned back, the light reflecting in his cold eyes, and the corner of his mouth curved slowly into a thin, deliberate smile. "Finally, you've come back," he said. The yellow desk light fell across the open file, casting a narrow glow in a room almost swallowed by darkness. Raymond Lander sat still for a few seconds, both hands resting on the page as if trying to confirm he wasn't misreading it. Wind outside the window created low, steady gusts, but inside the room, the silence was so heavy it made the air feel thick. He turned the first page, his eyes circling the italicized line listing the information of the cited man. When the name Walter Grayson appeared in the upper left corner, his eyelid twitched, and his breath halted. His lips tightened, a cold line stretching outward. He muttered softly, but every word seemed to break apart in the embrace. "It's him again, Walter Grayson." Lander leaned back in his chair, his hand running along the bridge of his nose, as if to push down the thoughts rising inside him. He turned to the second page. When he saw Walter's former unit, his chest rose and fell. The words "restricted unit" sat in the middle of the page, and his fingertips stopped on them for several seconds. He placed his hand over the line, not pressing hard, just enough to feel the paper bend under his skin. A heavy breath slipped from his chest. In that moment, the room seemed to pull backward into his memories. A voice rose from the past, low and cold like damp metal. "Don't let that man talk." It felt as though the words had been spoken behind him, even though they belonged to a man buried more than 2 decades ago. His father had spoken that way when giving orders, leaving no doubts in the minds of those under him. A voice of someone who never allowed the truth to slip out of his control. Lander opened his eyes, his gaze sharpening. He planted both hands on the desk edge and slammed them down on the wood, the sound cracking through the room. "Your whole life, you hid behind that torn uniform," he growled, as if Walter were standing right in front of him, forcing him to carry the weight of what had nearly destroyed his family. A memory of the young soldier surged back fast and without warning. The boy's face when he first joined the unit was bright and bookish, but the last face Lander ever saw was different, bruised, purple, eyes staring upward at the ceiling of the old interrogation room. A voice so faint it nearly dissolved into the air called out, "Mom." That scene had haunted his father, or at least that's what his father said, but what lay behind it? The details never written in any report. Only a few men knew, and Walter Grayson was one of them. Lander inhaled deeply to pull his calm back, but the rush of memories left him irritated and unsettled. "Father, I'll finish what you left behind," he whispered, a promise meant only for himself. Cold ran down his spine, not from the wind but from the obsession that had followed him since youth. His father had tried to bury the incident using the Delphi mechanism, a tool many high-ranking officers used to scrub reports that didn't match the unit's achievements, but not everything buried stayed underground. Walter's name brought back his father's helplessness in the last days of his career, when a piece of truth leaked out and toppled him. Lander grew up with the image of his father slumped in the dark. Every groan, every curse, every tap of his knuckles on the dinner table table. If that man hadn't turned on me, everything would have been different. He heard that line hundreds of times. That was why every time he saw Walter's name, his body reacted like being stabbed. Decades of resentment packed so tightly, he couldn't tell what was real and what was a shadow in his head. He brushed the edge of the file and straightened up. His eyes seemed to darken, not because of the lamp, but because he felt he was holding the last chance to eliminate a surviving threat. "It's time," he muttered. He pulled a blank sheet, took his pen, and signed an order to open an emergency hearing. The stroke so forceful the pen tip dug into the page. He spoke out loud, low but emphasizing every word, like giving a command in a military barracks. "I'll crush you on the very first day of the week." His hand trembled slightly when he set the pen down, but the tremor came from excitement, not fear. He had waited for this moment too long. The file was folded shut with a sharp motion. Lander looked at the desk surface and saw his faint reflection under the light. His pale face made him look like he had just stepped out of a memory thick with smoke and shadows, but in his eyes, a harsh red glint appeared, like a small flame burning deep inside a pit, refusing to die. He stood up and paced around the table, as if testing the feeling of an old past suddenly pulled back within reach. The office felt smaller, the air heavier. The framed certificates on the wall became silent witnesses to the shifting expression on his face. Everything around him blurred, leaving only the pounding of his heartbeat mixed with the wind outside the glass. Lander stopped and turned to look at the file on the desk, like it had just revealed a path to freeing him from years of mental weight. He reached out, picked up the desk phone, and dialed a familiar number. The line rang twice. When the call connected, his voice dropped sharp and commanding. "Prepare courtroom number 3. I want the fastest hearing in this county's history." The district courtroom was small and plain, with a high ceiling stained in patches and old fluorescent tubes that flickered occasionally. That morning, cold wind slipped through the door cracks, making the air even sharper, and the spectators pulled their coats tighter around themselves. Walter Grayson walked in, his shoulders slightly hunched after a sleepless night. He was still tired after the blood sugar dropped the previous morning, but he forced himself to sit up straight in the defendant's chair. So whispers from the back seats, not out of curiosity but something more like sympathy for the old man who had gotten tangled in trouble no one expected. Lander entered to the sound of dry footsteps. His presence felt like another gust of cold pushing into the room. He sat in the judge's chair, his hands placed on the wooden gavel in front of him, his eyes fixed on Walter. In that moment, the air seemed to sag. No one knew why that stare held so much resentment. Walter had sensed it from the very first moment he saw him, though he hadn't had time to understand why. The clerk read through the opening procedure in a steady voice. Walter sat still, trying to keep his breathing steady. Daniel Ruiz, the young court-appointed attorney assigned to defend him, entered the courtroom slightly later than usual. He unwrapped his scarf, gave Walter a small, reassuring nod, then opened the case file he had just been handed minutes before the hearing. His face froze when he saw certain lines in the report. But before he could ask Walter anything, Lander raised his hand signaling the start. The prosecutor stood, his voice ringing clearly through the room. The charges being read sounded far larger than what had actually happened. The wording felt exaggerated, each phrase positioned to make Walter look more like a dangerous troublemaker than a sick, elderly man. Lander nodded repeatedly, as if agreeing from the very first sentence. When Walter tried to open his mouth to object, Lander slammed the gavel against the desk. "Shut your mouth. You speak only when I ask." The entire courtroom stopped. A few spectators exchanged glances, uneasy with the judge's behavior. Walter tightened his trembling hand on the table. He inhaled, trying to stay calm, but the unfairness was too clear. "Your Honor, I only," Walter began. Lander cut him off, his voice sharp like a blade. "An old man who still dares to defy an officer is even more deserving of detention. Don't make me repeat myself." Walter fell silent for a few seconds. He didn't know where such hostility came from, but the tone felt like someone who had already decided his fate. Daniel leaned forward, ready to speak. "Your Honor." The body cam. A public defender trying to play hero. Lander stared at Daniel like staring at an obstacle. "You planning to teach me how to run a courtroom?" Daniel saw clearly that something was wrong, and he didn't back down. "No, Your Honor. I'm trying to clarify the evidence. The tech report states the camera malfunctioned for exactly 3 crucial minutes. At the moment the dispute began, Lander remained silent for a few seconds. But it wasn't the silence of consideration, it was the silence of searching for a counterattack. That's the technical department's issue. The court doesn't care about trivial glitches. Walter placed a hand on his chest, his breath caught between beats. He tried to sit upright, but Lander's glare at him was filled with contempt. "Still pretending you're about to faint? Stop with those tired tricks. Daniel frowned. The spectators began feeling something wasn't right. Whispered remarks spread slowly but clearly. A woman in the third row lowered her voice toward the person next to her. He hates Walter. Look, like there's some old grudge. The prosecutor continued reading from the report, but Daniel raised his hand to stop him. Your Honor, this section has been altered. This added line doesn't match the system record. Lander struck the table sharply. I decide what's altered and what's not. Daniel felt a hot rush go up his neck. He stared straight at the judge, but the truth is still the truth. I have the right to request verification. The entire courtroom turned toward Lander, not out of fear but because they recognized something wrong. Walter drew in a deep breath, his hand still on his chest. He felt discomfort spreading in his ribs but forced himself not to show it, not wanting to give anyone an excuse to add another accusation. Lander pressed his lips together, then declared something no one expected. Based on the file and the defendant's attitude, I'm considering detaining Mr. Fawn. Grayson. The whispers turned into small protests. A young man stood halfway up, then sat again when he saw security glance his way. Walter looked down at his hands that had once held a rifle, once carried injured comrades, now trembled from being treated like a criminal with no way out. Daniel inhaled sharply and stood up. His voice rose so clearly that the entire courtroom froze. Objection. The report has been falsified. That sentence cut through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. The prosecutor stopped reading. The clerk lifted her head, and everyone looked at Daniel in shock. Lander fell suddenly silent, his hand gripping the gavel. Silence stretched for several seconds like a taut surface ready to burst. Lander sat unmoving, a twitch pulling at the corner of his mouth. He could not continue the hearing right after such an accusation. From the standpoint of someone in power, it was a direct strike in open court, and he had no choice but to postpone the session to avoid making the suspicion too obvious. The clerk looked toward Lander, waiting for instruction. A heavy breath filled the room. Lander struck the gavel, the sound dry and harsh, then announced the postponement with frustration carved into every line of his face. But before standing, he glanced toward Walter. That look was cold and sharp, like the edge of a blade hidden beneath thin paper. He didn't say a word, but everyone could read in his eyes that the second hearing would not allow Walter a shred of relief. That looked closed like a darkened lock on what was coming next. The afternoon passed in a quiet kind of chaos, and by the time night settled over the neighborhood where Daniel Ruiz rented a small room, the heaviness from the morning hearing still followed him like a long shadow. Snow was still falling, not as fiercely as in the morning but slow and thick, giving the town an almost unnaturally quiet look. Daniel hung his coat on the chair, exhaling hard to loosen the weight pressing on his shoulders. He opened the unfinished case file from court and looked at the lines suspected of being altered. The link between Lander and Walter's file was clear as daylight, but he still hadn't seen the full darkness behind it. He turned on the old desk lamp, its tired yellow light spreading across the pages. His hand trembled slightly as it touched the thin envelope holding the original Delphi document that the quiet man in the archives had given him before he left the courthouse. That man hadn't dared say much. Only, you need this, and keep it quiet. Daniel pressed the envelope lightly to his chest, like an instinctive form of self-protection. He knew this document would change everything, and he also knew it might cost him more than it gave. The room was so quiet he could hear the clock ticking. Daniel hadn't opened the envelope yet when a loud noise hit the door. Before he could turn his head, the door flew open, its hinges screaming, and 3 men stepped inside like a black storm. Their shadows swallowed the lamp's light, forming 3 dark shapes, stretching across the wooden floor. One of them moved before the air even had time to shift, grabbing Daniel by the collar and yanking him out of the chair. He was thrown onto the bed, his back slamming into the old mattress with a heavy thud. You like going against the judge, huh? The man's voice hammered the air like steel on steel. His hot breath hit Daniel's face, spitting the threat one word at a time. Daniel tried to get up, but the second man grabbed his hair and slammed his head against the wall. The impact made a flash burst across his vision. If you open your mouth next hearing, the man said, his voice dropping low, cold enough to freeze Daniel's blood, I guarantee no one will find the body. Daniel struggled to breathe but forced himself to speak. I'm following the law. I didn't do anything wrong. His breath was weak, but his voice held the bit of steadiness he had learned from long hours at court. The third man, the biggest of the 3, laughed with contempt. The law here is whatever Lander writes. He squeezed Daniel's shoulder so hard a small crack sounded like a bone about to split. You think that courthouse belongs to justice? Daniel tried to speak, but a sharp breath caught in his throat. A punch across his jaw sent him falling sideways. The room blurred for a few seconds. The first man leaned down close to Daniel's face. Get this straight, he said in a calm, cold voice filled with calculation. Stay quiet and live. Talk and die. We don't like repeating simple things. They left as fast and clean as they had entered. The door was kicked shut, slamming so hard the sound clung to the walls. Daniel lay on his side on the cold floor, breathing rough and uneven. He touched the cut on his face, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. A burning ache spread from his bruised jaw, but his left hand still clutched the envelope holding the original Delphi file, like a survival reflex. Even in pain and fear, he knew this was the only thing that could save Walter and expose the truth Lander wanted buried. He forced himself upright, his head spinning, then leaned against the wall, his eyes on the envelope. That thin sheet of paper weighed as much as a truth trapped for decades. He took a deep breath, whispering to himself, "Don't give up." In his eyes, fear and determination fused into something sharper than usual. Meanwhile, farther out toward the suburbs, Walter's wooden house sat under a cold but gentle night. The small fire in the stove cast wavering lines on the ceiling, lighting the deep wrinkles on his face. Walter sat at the dining table, a long-opened envelope before him, its paper yellowed with age, the word Delphi, written neatly on top. OP made him shudder. Beside it was his wife's letter, the edges worn, but the handwriting still soft. He looked at the last line she wrote before she died. "Silence is killing us." Walter's hand trembled as he touched the sentence. Old memories rushed back like a sudden wind lifting soil long packed down. He saw the young soldier again, just past 20, eyes wide in the interrogation room, his voice weakening, calling for his mother with his last breaths. Bloodstains on the old uniform. The cold hand was gripping Walter's for the final time. Walter lowered his head, his chest tightening as though a thorn pressed deep inside. He had tried to lock that memory away in the deepest part of his life. For years, he chose silence, thinking it would protect the people he loved. But now silence had become a shadow, smothering everything. The words in the letter echoed through his mind, each one a needle-piercing old armor. He pressed his hands to the table and pushed himself up. His legs wavered slightly, but his eyes no longer did. He looked at the family photo on the wooden shelf. His wife was smiling gently, and he stood beside her with a hand on her shoulder. Walter looked into the eyes of the woman he had loved for half a lifetime, and whispered to himself a promise he had never spoken aloud. He picked up the letter, holding it lightly between his fingers. "This time, I'll speak." Determination rose inside him as simply as breathing but as strong as the roots of an old tree. He knew what would happen when he stood up against something so many had tried to bury, but he did not step back. Tomorrow, the truth needed to appear in court. At the same time, Daniel wiped the blood from his face, stood up, and pulled the curtain aside. He needed to be sure no one was watching. But as soon as the curtain shifted halfway, light from outside hit the room. A black SUV sat below on the street, its engine still running. The windows were so dark he couldn't see who was inside, but Daniel could feel a gaze fixed on his window. He swallowed a rough breath, his hand tightening around the Delphi envelope like a final affirmation. The night stood still, as if waiting for the next explosion. The morning before the second hearing cast a thick gray color over Cleveland, the snow no longer falling heavily, but the wind still cold enough to cut through a coat. Daniel Ruiz left his rented room with several new bruises, his movements slower, because the pain from the night before still lingered. Streetlights reflected on the thin layer of ice on the sidewalk, turning the road into scattered cold points of light. He gripped the envelope, holding the Delphi file inside his jacket pocket, hidden deep under the fabric, like someone holding on to the last bit of warmth of a truth buried for far too long. When he got into the car, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The black SUV was no longer parked beneath his window, but that didn't make him feel safer. It felt like a shadow that knew how to disappear at the right moment to make its target even more uneasy. He fastened his seatbelt and started the engine, hoping he was early enough to avoid whatever might happen, and reach the courthouse before the hearing began. The road toward the district center was emptier than usual, likely because the sharp weather kept people indoors. Quiet neighborhoods passed by outside the window, snow gathering on rooftops and steps like memories frozen in time. Daniel kept a steady speed, his eyes darting to both sides of the road, even though he couldn't explain why his neck stayed tense, as if trying to listen for something unusual. As he approached the turn leading to the main road, a bright light swept across the windshield, making him squint. The black SUV behind him accelerated, then suddenly forced itself against his right side. Daniel turned the wheel to avoid it, but the gap was too narrow. His tires slid on the ice, and the car was pushed into the curb with the screech of metal scraping concrete. The SUV's engine roared before coming to a stop. Its doors burst open at the same time, and 4 men stepped out, their heavy movements making the vehicle tilt slightly. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew what had happened the night before hadn't ended. It had only paused long enough to return in a more brutal form. The first man reached his car and yanked the door open, dragging Daniel out like a sack. Daniel staggered but tried to stay upright. The man grabbed his collar, pulling their faces close, his breath reeking of cigarettes and threat. "You're not getting to court today." He spoke each word as if stating an obvious fact. Daniel braced a hand on the car to steady himself. "I have the right," he said, but the sentence cut off when a hard slap snapped his head to the side. His cheek burned, and the world tilted for a moment. "Your right is to shut up." The man who slapped him glared with the sharp focus of a predator spotting weakness. The other 3 closed in, forming a circle that left him no room to retreat or run. One of them stepped forward, reaching into Daniel's coat, searching through every pocket. "Where's the paper? Hand it over." His voice stretched tight like a strained string about to snap. Daniel covered the side of his chest where the envelope was hidden, stepping back half a pace by instinct to protect it. "I don't have." His words were cut short by a kick to the stomach that folded him in half, dropping him onto the frozen ground. Snow dust scattered as his body hit. The leader crouched and grabbed Daniel's chin, forcing his face upward. His voice came out low and solid like a sentence being passed. "One word from Lander is enough to make you disappear from this city." Daniel met his eyes, bruised but unyielding. He pressed his lips together, his right hand holding the envelope beneath his body, shielding it as the last guard he had left. A sound echoed from the main road. All eyes turned. A small truck was approaching and slowed when the driver saw what was happening. The man behind the wheel, somewhere in his 40s, leaned out, his eyes widening at the sight of Daniel being cornered. He lifted his phone, snapped a photo of the SUV's license plate without hesitation, then shouted enough to shake the street. "I saw everything. I'm calling the police right now." The moment stretched tight, like a string drawn to its breaking point. The 4 men reacted instantly. The leader cursed, narrowing his eyes at the truck driver, weighing the risks. But he knew the rules. A witness, a clear photo, and a public location could turn their plan from intimidation into a charge far more serious. "Get in the car," he ordered through clenched teeth. The 3 others retreated at once, heading quickly for the SUV. The leader looked at Daniel for one last second, a mix of fury and warning in his eyes, then jerked his head. "You got lucky this time." Then he climbed into the back seat. The SUV roared to life, its tires spraying ice, leaving a cloud of white mist as it shot down the steel-cold street. Daniel remained on the ground, his breath broken and uneven. He pushed his hands against the road, trying to stand. His whole body hurt, but his right hand still clutched the envelope like the last pulse of justice he could hold. The truck driver ran to him, asking if he needed a hospital, but Daniel shook his head. "I need to get to court," he said, between gasps. The man looked at his bruised face and recognized the fire in Daniel's eyes. He stepped back and let him go. Daniel pulled his coat tight, swaying slightly, but kept moving. Snow settled on his hair in thin patches, unable to stop the steps that quickened beneath it. He ran, though his legs felt weighted like stone. Every breath tore at his chest, but he ran through each street corner, pushing past the thickening snow, because ahead, the courthouse waited, and Walter needed him. The Delphi envelope stayed in his hand, pressed close beneath his coat, like a small flame surrounded by a storm, but still burning to light the last stretch of the road. Near the courthouse, Daniel paused once to breathe, his hand numb from the cold, but refusing to loosen. Then he pushed forward again, toward the building, glowing faintly under the thin curtain of snow. He stepped into the frozen courtyard, face bruised, lips bleeding, but his eyes unbroken. On the morning of the second hearing, the courthouse hallway was so crowded it was hard to move. News of the previous day's postponed session had spread throughout the district, drawing in people who had no direct connection to the case but sensed something bigger than a traffic violation was waiting to surface. The old wooden benches in courtroom number 3 were filled early, and people whispered to each other in low voices, as if afraid to touch the tension in the air. Walter Grayson stepped in under a heavy silence. A few eyes lingered on him longer than usual, not in curiosity, but in a mix of respect and pity. He walked slowly, his back straight, his face calmer than in the first session. A long night with the Delphi envelope, and the memory of the young soldier had shown him clearly what he needed to do. Though his body was still tired, he no longer trembled like before. Each step he took in this room sounded like knocking on an old door about to open, something locked away for 40 years. The courtroom door swung open without warning. Raymond Lander appeared. He said nothing as he walked to the judge's bench, but his expression spoke louder than words. His stare aimed at Walter like a spear that had been sharpened beforehand. The hatred in his eyes was thick enough to see even through the shadow of his robe. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and placed both hands on the desk. The light tapping of his fingertips on the wooden surface echoed rhythmically, like the signal of a storm about to break. No one spoke. Only breathing and the soft rustle of the clerk's papers could be heard as she prepared to begin the session. Lander looked straight at Walter, his voice not loud but sharp as steel. "Today you will pay for this." There was no objection, no shout. The air was too thick for any sound to squeeze through. Walter stood, his old eyes bright with certainty. "I have nothing left to lose," he answered in a steady, low voice. Lander tilted his head slightly, a vicious smile appearing on his face. "Then let me help you lose whatever rotten honor you have left." Some spectators shivered. They could feel the hostility between the two men was nothing like a typical courtroom dispute. Something deeper, older, and darker hid behind their words. The prosecutor prepared to read the charges again, but before he could speak, Walter began, his eyes never leaving Lander. "I know what your father did." The sentence dropped into the room like a weight. The prosecutor stopped. The clerk lifted her head, and Lander slammed the desk. The gavel hit with an ear-splitting crack. "Shut your mouth," he spat, snapping each word. "I forbid you to mention him." Walter didn't blink. He stayed calm in a way that suggested he hadn't feared power for a very long time. He took a small step toward the bench, not close enough to be considered threatening, but close enough to show he wouldn't back down. "No, this time I will speak." Whispers erupted in the back rows. A woman covered her mouth to hide her shock. A man leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Something big is coming." No one cared about procedure anymore. Everyone watched the center of the room as if two blades were about to collide. Lander's face turned pale, but his eyes burned with an unnatural fire. He tried to control his breathing, but the tension in his jaw was too visible. Walter saw all of it and recognized that father and son were more alike than he'd wanted to believe. The father had tried to bury the truth. Now the son was trying to bury the man who carried it. Daniel hadn't arrived yet, so Walter had no support except himself. But that didn't shake him. He had faced battlefields, had watched young men die who didn't deserve to, and had lived a lifetime in silence. And he knew silence today would only make something worse happen tomorrow. Walter's voice rose again, softer this time but clear. "You ask if I'm afraid. I'm not afraid of you. I was afraid of living without saying what needed to be said, but that ended last night." Lander tightened his grip on the gavel, his fingertips turning white. The prosecutor looked to him for direction, but he didn't look at anyone, only at Walter. As he wanted to pierce through the old man, the air thickened until it felt touchable. Spectators held their breath. A few placed their hands on their chests, afraid that what was coming would go beyond the bounds of any ordinary hearing. A man at the back door hesitated, unsure if he should step outside to call security. Walter took a deep breath. It was so soft it seemed no one should hear it, yet in that silence it became the only sound left. He kept his hands at his side, neither shaking nor retreating, then opened his mouth. The words came out like a blade striking the wooden table. "Call sign, Delphi." The entire courtroom froze as though the air had been sucked out. Every sound vanished, leaving a silence so deep that even the wind slapping the back window could be heard. Courtroom number 3 grew so heavy that no one could even hear their own breathing after Walter spoke those 2 words. Every head in the room turned toward him at the same time, as if pulled by an invisible string. The crowded space suddenly shrank, cold and dense like fog clinging to the window panes. Everything that had happened minutes earlier, the attacks, the arguments, the hateful stares, was drowned out by the dull echo of a name, buried for 40 years. Walter stood in the middle of the room, his body slightly leaning with age, but his eyes as solid as a rock that couldn't be pushed over. He didn't add another word. He didn't need to. Delphi alone was enough to throw the entire room off balance. Raymond Lander's lover and legal advisor, sitting in the left row, froze like a statue. She stepped back half a pace, her hand gripping the bench, her lips trembling so much she couldn't force out a sound. The color drained from her face, leaving only the numbness of someone who had just heard the name of something that was never supposed to exist outside the dark. Lander reacted the strongest. He shot up from the judge's chair as if stabbed by a needle. The seat behind him slammed into the wall with a dry crack. His face went so pale it was indistinguishable from the collar of his robe. His mouth opened in shock. then tightened into a hard, violent line. "What did you justice why?" he asked, but the authority was gone. His voice cracked like someone squeezing his vocal cords shut. Walter didn't step back. He took one small but solid step forward. "Delphi," he said, his voice low and clear, as if reading out a charge the world had buried long ago. "The procedure your father used to bury innocent bodies." A loud gasp burst from the back row. The woman near the door clutched her mouth. A middle-aged man in the second row stood up without thinking, then sat again when his legs weakened. Someone in the gallery even made the sign of the cross, as if they had just heard the name of something forbidden that mortals weren't meant to touch. Lander's lover tried to speak, but her breath kept breaking. "No, that's not supposed to exist," she whispered to herself more than to anyone else. Her eyes held the despair of someone who had sunk into the mud once and knew it was pulling her down again. Lander staggered a step. He grabbed the desk for balance, but the grip turned instantly into rage. "Shut your mouth," he screamed, his throat tight, his voice scraping like stone on a wall. "None of that is admissible." The English sentence was spat out like a firing order. Walter didn't raise his voice. He stood steady, like someone long accustomed to the pain of loss. "The 21-year-old soldier called for his mother before he died," he said, each word falling like a stone into a deep well. "How long do you want me to stay silent?" A cry escaped from the back of the room. An older woman grabbed her son's hand, her eyes wet. "My God," she said through trembling lips. "What did they do in the military?" Her words weren't directed at anyone, just the late realization of a truth heard too late. Lander whipped his head toward the prosecutor, his shoulders bunched, his breathing ragged, his eyes bloodshot with a mix of rage and panic. "Erase the record," he ordered, his voice sharp like it was scraped through his teeth. "Erase everything. I command it." The prosecutor froze. His hands shook as he flipped a page. "Your Honor," he stammered, "you don't have the authority to order that. Court records are—" "Do it," Lander growled. "I already said it." "But—" The prosecutor looked around, seeing the entire courtroom watching. "If I do that in front of everyone here, I'll be violating federally supervised procedure." Lander didn't speak, but not because he calmed down. His chest rose and fell like he had just run a mile. He stared at Walter with a fury no one had seen before. It was the rage of years held in, the wound of his family that still bled whenever someone touched it. Walter kept looking at him, but there was no hatred in his eyes, only a silent kind of pain. It wasn't the look of someone seeking revenge. It was the look of someone who had carried a secret his entire life, and finally reached the point where he couldn't carry it anymore. The spectators held their breath. No one dared to move. A young man bent halfway to pick up his dropped phone but froze, afraid. Even a small sound would set off chaos. Lander grabbed the front of his robe, squeezing until his knuckles turned white. His jaw twitched, his eyes burning like two flames licking up from a deep pit. He tried to speak, but the words stuck. He slammed his hand onto the desk, the noise hitting the room like a hammer. A long moment passed with no one speaking, not even Walter, not out of fear, but because everyone could see something breaking inside Lander. Something he had held shut for years had slipped, and now he couldn't force it closed again. Then, as if the last thread inside him snapped, Lander lunged from the judge's bench. He jumped down the wooden steps, his shoes scraping the floor with a sharp sound. People screamed as he charged straight at Walter. His arm shot forward, his hand open as if ready to seize the old man's throat in front of the entire room. Dozens of screams erupted at once. Papers flew, chairs toppled, and the courtroom burst into chaos. That moment closed like a blade slicing through the air. The crash of chairs, the chaotic footsteps, and the rising screams blended into one shattered string of noises inside courtroom number 3. The echo of Lander leaping from the judge's bench hadn't even faded before he closed in on Walter. His eyes wild from a mix of fear, hatred, and an animal instinct triggered the moment the word Delphi was spoken. Walter stepped back half a pace when he saw him coming, but age slowed his reflexes. Lander grabbed his collar with both hands, pulling him toward his own distorted, hot breath. He screamed in a voice strangled between frenzy and desperation, "I'll bury you the way my father buried your kind." The entire room froze for half a second at those words. It wasn't just an attack, it was an accidental confession. People in the back rows looked at one another in horror. A few covered their mouths. Others felt a cold shiver run down their spines when they heard him mention his father in a threat, as if the tradition of wrongdoing had been passed from one generation to the next. Walter stood firm in an uncanny way, as if he had long been used to facing enemies, or like an old wolf who had seen enough hunters not to panic at a sudden charge. He gripped Lander's wrist, tightening, despite his trembling hand. "I'm not afraid anymore, Lander," he said, his voice tight but steady. From both sides of the room, 2 security officers rushed in, their shoes crunching over the papers scattered on the floor. They tried to wedge themselves between the men, but Lander whipped his head back and screamed as if betrayed. "Get away," he roared, his face red with rage. "This is treason." The words made the room fall silent again, because they were so absurd that it was suffocating. Someone near the door let out a stifled snort, as if wanting to laugh but not daring to in such a dangerous moment. The harsh sound of Lander's choking breaths made it clear he was at the edge of losing control entirely. In the middle of the chaos came another voice, not from anger, but from absolute fear. His lover, the woman on the advisory bench, shot to her feet. Her hair shook, her eyes wide, staring at Lander as if she were seeing a different version of him she had never believed he could become. "Raymond, stop," she said, her voice breaking, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're destroying yourself." Lander spun toward her, his face twisted with rage. "Shut up," he shouted. "This is all your fault." A hiss of shock came from the row behind her. She stepped back half a pace under his fury. Her hand clutched her chest, her breath shaking. "Don't put it on me," she shot back, trembling but sharp. "This started with Delphi, you know that." Walter looked at her, his expression stunned for a brief second. She lowered her head as if bracing herself for a truth she had avoided too long. "You made me alter the report," she said, this time clearly, firmly, without turning back. "I followed your orders. I touched something I should never have touched." The room exploded into frantic whispers. A man stood up, eyes wide. She admitted it. A woman covered her mouth, turning to the friend beside her. They knew about Delphi, and hid it. The truth landed in the courtroom like a heavy stone, leaving everyone unsure how to react to the unexpected boldness of the woman who had once stood behind Lander. Lander shook his head, stepping back, then forward, then back again, like he had lost all sense of direction. His hand twitched, then lifted as if to strike her. "You betrayed me," he shouted, his voice cracking. The woman stood her ground, tears gathering in her eyes but refusing to flinch. "I betrayed what you made me do," she said, her voice tight. "Not you." The second guard grabbed Lander's arm from behind, pulling hard but still with the minimal respect owed to a judge. Lander jerked his arm free, trying to lash out again. A crash of breaking glass sounded at someone's feet, but no one looked down. Everyone's eyes were locked on Lander, no longer the composed figure of authority, but a twisting, violent shape like a man stripped of his mask. Another guard lunged in, both hands gripping Lander's shoulders. Lander fought back, his chest heaving like a cornered animal. He almost swung again when the 2 guards moved in unison and slammed him down onto the floor. His shoes skidded on the thin dust across the courtroom. A loose sheet of paper fluttered across the floor in a draft of cold air from the window. Lander lay pinned down, his entire body shaking with a mix of rage and fear. At that exact moment, the courtroom door burst open so hard it slammed against the wall with a bang. Everyone turned their heads. Standing in the doorway was Daniel Ruiz, his face bruised, his clothes dusted with snow, his breath ragged, and his hand raised high, holding an old envelope. His voice rang out, hoarse but full of force. "Stop. I have the original Delphi file." The door of courtroom number 3 shook as if someone had struck it hard from outside. Every gaze in the room swung toward it, toward the place where the sound had cracked through like a fissure in the ground. A few people jumped to their feet, while others leaned back as if afraid the earlier chaos was about to return. No one had time to imagine what was coming next, until the door burst open again with a sharp, tearing sound. Standing in the doorway was Daniel Ruiz. His hair was matted with sweat and snow. Dried blood clung to the corner of his mouth. One cheek was bruised, and his eyes were still red from impact and from the frantic run he had made to the courthouse with whatever strength was left in him. He breathed heavily, one hand gripping the doorframe to keep himself upright, and raised the other. In his tightened fingers was a paper envelope, creased at the edges but intact. The entire courtroom lost its sound. No one spoke, no one moved. Only Daniel's ragged breathing filled the room, blending with the cold wind seeping through the doorframe. He fought for air, then spoke in a hoarse voice that broke apart in pieces. "Your Honor, this is the original Delphi file, untouched." A loud gasp shot up from somewhere in the back, spreading quickly like falling dominoes. People turned to each other with wide eyes. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. A woman whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "My God, they hid this for 40 years. Daniel stepped farther into the courtroom, his legs unsteady from cold and pain. He nearly had to brace himself against a bench to keep standing. But as he reached the center of the room, The ceiling lights fell across the envelope, making it the only thing that seemed alive in the chaos. Lander's lover and legal advisor stood nearby. When Daniel raised the envelope higher, she instantly covered her mouth. Whatever color remained on her face drained until she looked ghostly. I've seen that signature, she breathed, her voice so thin it almost disappeared between the sounds of breathing. On the floor, where 2 guards were pinning him down, Raymond Lander thrashed wildly. He kicked, clenched his teeth, and screamed like someone whose sanity was slipping. "It's fake," he shouted, his voice cracking. "All of it. It means nothing." Daniel paused for a second, staring straight into Lander's reddened eyes. Then he opened the envelope, pulling out the carefully preserved pages, each marked with old ink. He held up the first page and spoke each word clearly. "Signed by your father." He flipped to the next. "Date, time, involved personnel, everything matches." His voice was steady now. Each sentence seemed to anchor him more firmly. Walter, standing toward the front with one hand braced against the table, felt his eyes sting, not from weakness, not from fear, but because what he had carried in silence for so many years had finally been placed where it belonged. He looked at Daniel and gave a small nod, the way a teacher nods when a student accomplishes something immense. "You made it," he said, his voice not loud but enough for Daniel to hear. Daniel breathed hard, but a faint, emotional smile appeared on his lips, just in time. Meanwhile, the prosecutor stepped forward, as if pulled by the weight of the documents. He took the stack from Daniel, his hands trembling as he understood the gravity of what he was holding. His eyes ran across the first lines, and his expression tightened. "We need a full investigation immediately." His voice rang out like the final confirmation that the truth had entered the room and now stood among them. The crowd erupted. Some pushed forward to try to see the pages. A woman whispered, "If this is real, an entire system helped cover a crime." An older man near the door spoke through clenched teeth. "Unbelievable." The guards' footsteps thudded across the floor as they moved to reinforce control over Lander. The judge still struggled, but his strength waned as more hands held him down. Even so, his eyes burned with fury. A guard snapped handcuffs around Lander's wrists, the metallic click sounding like the closing point of the power he once held. Another guard pressed his arm down, securing him. Lander tilted his head, his red eyes no longer human, but like those of a cornered animal. "Stand," a guard ordered. They hauled him up halfway, then seated him, though he continued to twist and pull, clinging to the last shreds of authority in his voice. His cuffed fists tightened until the knuckles drained white. Sweat ran along his temple, clumping into his hair. Every gaze in the room landed on him, some afraid, some furious, some coldly pitying, but no one intervened. Everyone waited to hear what he would say, now that he could no longer hide. Then, in that moment, Lander lifted his head, his eyes drilling into the crowd. His voice came out hoarse but clear, like metal cracking under too much heat. "If I fall," he screamed, each word ripping through the air, "all of them fall with me." The crowded room froze at that line. No one reacted, no breath sounded, no one knew who he meant by them, but the truth in his words hit the room like a stone dropping into still water, leaving everyone suspended in rising fear. A cold lock clicked shut over the hearing in that exact sentence. The air in the courtroom thickened, right after Lander's final scream. The metallic clank of handcuffs as he tried to wrench himself free sounded like the cry of an animal cornered. With his hair disheveled, collar crooked, and face flushed red with rage, he no longer resembled a judge at all. He looked like a man stripped bare in the light, forced to face what he had buried all his life. Spectators pulled back to keep a distance, but their eyes stayed glued to the man thrashing under the hands of 3 security officers. Lander looked as if he were falling into an uncontrollable fit, his breath rapid, his lips shaking with a mix of fury and panic. The frightening part wasn't his violence, but the raw truth, spilling from him through his own madness. "You think Delphi has only one file?" Lander shouted, his voice scraping out like metal ground against stone. "You don't know anything." The whole courtroom fell dead silent. Those present looked at each other as if unsure they had heard correctly. Daniel, still panting from the run and the assault outside, turned toward Walter. Walter kept his gaze steady, his lips pressed together like someone who always knew this sentence would come, sooner or later, one he had feared most as a young soldier. Lander's lover, standing at the head of the left row, shifted a step. Her hand clutched the edge of her clothes as if to keep herself from collapsing. "Raymond, stop talking," she said, her voice trembling like a guitar string pulled too tight. But hearing her only fueled him further. He lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto her. A twisted smile, almost the smile of someone losing his sanity, curved across his lips. You think I'll take the blame alone, he said, a raspy laugh following. You're in it up to your neck. She stepped back, bumping into the bench behind her. Her shoulders shook visibly. I only followed you, she whispered, her eyes lowered, as someone dragged back into memories she had spent years avoiding. Lander jerked both his hands forward despite the cuffs. The movement forced the guards to tighten their grip. No, he screamed. You erased the files. You rewrote the report. A wave of murmurs rolled from the back like a crashing tide. Daniel clenched his fists, and the prosecutor stepped forward, his face darkened by the weight of what he had just heard. Spoken aloud in open court, the prosecutor turned to the woman, his voice firm but not loud. Is that true? She opened her mouth several times, but no words came out. Her eyes blinked rapidly as if trying to contain something boiling inside. At last, she released the cloth she'd been gripping, raised her hand to cover part of her face, and a choked sob escaped before she managed to speak. I followed orders, she said, her voice so tight it sounded squeezed shut in her throat. He forced me. That sound alone was enough to pull the room into a deep silence, not an ordinary silence, but the kind that feels like standing at the edge between two worlds. When someone steps out of darkness after hiding in it too long, truth doesn't just illuminate the space, it scorches everything they once depended on. Walter looked at her, his aging eyes sharp like an old knife, freshly sharpened. It's time everyone pays, he said quietly, his tone heavy rather than harsh. No one thought he said it out of cruelty. It sounded like a sigh from someone who had seen generations of tragedy and understood that eventually, every shadow has to step out of hiding. Lander lifted his head toward Walter, his bloodshot eyes swelling with an anger that wouldn't die. He jerked his chin toward the woman and shouted, See, they're all against me. Everything I did was to protect my father's legacy. Do you know what he sacrificed for the military? A guard tightened his grip on Lander's shoulder to stop him from thrashing, but Lander kept talking, like a man unable to stop himself until he vomited all the poison that had lived inside him too long. That girl, he snarled, she knows everything. From start to finish, Delphi didn't stop at one soldier. My father protected the entire unit, the honor of the nation. The woman let out a strangled sob. Not protected, she said through her tears, covered up, distorted. Then she turned to the prosecutor as if seeking salvation. I saw more than I thought, and I stayed silent. Silent, Walter repeated under his breath, his eyes narrowing slightly. Silence is how people get buried. The sentence made her tremble, because it wasn't spoken about Walter or the young soldier alone. It was spoken about her. The prosecutor inhaled deeply before speaking. We need your cooperation. His voice balanced firmness with a way forward. Behind them, Daniel watched the scene and understood that what was happening was no longer about a traffic violation, nor about a judge's abuse of power. It was the final curtain ripping away from a rotten system. Everything had started with a turn signal mistake, but its roots lay decades deep beneath bent memories and falsified reports. The woman stood still for a few seconds, then lowered her hand from her face. Tear tracks lingered on her cheeks. Her expression settled into a somber stillness, no longer shaking, as if her fear had reached its limit and crumbled into a thin layer of ash. She inhaled, lifted her head, looked at the prosecutor, then at Walter. In that moment, the entire courtroom held its breath. She said, slowly but more firmly than before. I'll tell everything. About Delphi, about his father, about all of it. The declaration dropped into the courtroom like the final lock closing this chapter, opening a door to a truth that had never been allowed to be spoken. The air in courtroom 3 thickened like decades-old dust being stirred up. Everyone understood that this moment would be unlike any testimony ever given in the county courthouse. The woman standing beside the left row of seats, her shoulders still trembling from the shock of the last minutes, took a deep breath. She looked around the chaotic room, the papers scattered on the floor, Lander handcuffed and pinned down under the supervision of 2 security officers, Walter still standing straight like an old wooden pillar holding firm in the cold wind. Her gaze rested on Daniel for a moment, then fell on Walter, as if seeking permission to take one more step into the truth she had avoided for 4 decades. She released her hand from the seat's edge and stepped forward. The soft sound of her shoes touching the wooden floor echoed sharply to those holding their breath. The prosecutor signaled the clerk to prepare to record the testimony. The entire room was wrapped in a silence that only truly important moments could create. When she reached the witness stand, she raised her hand, her palm trembling slightly, but when her voice came out, it was clear, low, and heavy. Delphi was used to bury inconvenient deaths. The words dropped into the room like a blade cutting through a veil that had been held up for 40 years. Some spectators jerked back. An elderly woman near the door hissed in a sharp breath. A young man gripped the armrest so tightly, his knuckles turned white. the woman continued, her voice still uneven but more resolute. Raymond Lander's father. He didn't investigate. He gave orders. She pointed toward Walter, but her eyes drifted into space as if digging up memories she never wanted to face again. They forced him to sign. If he didn't, he would end up like the young soldier. A sob broke from the back. A young man shot to his feet and then dropped back down as if he couldn't keep his balance after hearing it. His voice cracked. He was only 21. A shadow of someone none of them knew appeared in their minds, a young man wronged, dying in silence, echoing through the woman's trembling voice. The prosecutor raised his hand. Names of those involved, he said, holding his pen, notebook already open. Ranks, units, any details related to the Delphi procedure. The woman lowered her eyes to the papers in her hand. She read each name, each rank, each signature. Her voice no longer shook like at the start, but was even and cold, as if every sentence was another layer of earth being scraped away to reveal the real bones of the story beneath. No one in the courtroom dared move. They heard every name, every title, every piece of history that had long been claimed not to exist. Daniel stood at an angle, his hand still on the envelope with tension, but his eyes grew lighter as each detail began to align with the original Delphi file he'd brought. He only breathed deeply, no interruptions, no questions, because he knew this moment belonged to the truth, not to him. The woman turned her head toward Walter. She paused for several seconds, as though gathering the strength to speak the rest. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice catching, "for letting you carry this pain alone." Walter looked at her, no anger, no accusation, only the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to understand that silence was sometimes not a choice, but the product of pressure and fear no outsider could fully comprehend. He nodded slightly, his eyes reddened, but his voice didn't crack. "I know," he said softly enough that only she could hear, though a few nearby sensed the compassion in his tone. "It's long past." Right then, from the corner of the room where Lander's hands were locked and his body held to the ground, he screamed in a fractured voice, "All of you betray me. Everyone you." He thrashed like an animal cut off from escape, his eyes wild, not simply angry, but terrified. They were the eyes of someone who knew every line of defense had collapsed, and the shouting was only the desperate reflex of survival. But no one looked at him anymore. Every attention had shifted away from Lander and toward the woman's ongoing testimony. She continued speaking, each detail recorded by the prosecutor. With each name spoken, each fragment of the truth, long hidden in darkness, was brought out into the light. The narrative moved from unit descriptions to procedures for erasing traces to the forced acceptance of falsified reports. The atmosphere changed steadily, no longer whispers of panic, but the silence of people realizing they were witnessing something historic. The 21-year-old soldier's name resurfaced, this time spoken by someone who could no longer bear seeing his death buried like an unspeakable mistake. The words made many hearts sink. The woman stopped after a long stretch, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. The prosecutor looked at her, then at the papers. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging that everything she said carried more weight than any falsified record that had been altered for years. Meanwhile, Walter remained still, like the last pillar of a collapsing building. He looked at the woman, then at Lander. A piece of an old memory flashed, the young soldier calling for his mother. Years ago, the old man inhaled deeply and stayed silent, letting the truth be spoken for the first time in decades by the person who needed to speak it. As the prosecutor prepared to conclude the testimony, strong footsteps sounded at the door. The courtroom door swung open. A federal officer entered, snow still clinging to his coat, the badge on his lapel catching the light. His gaze swept across the room, stopping on Walter, on Daniel, then on the woman whose tears still streaked her cheek. He spoke in a deep, decisive voice. "From this moment on, the Delphi case is placed under federal investigation." The room froze instantly in absolute silence. The sound of shoes striking hard against the hallway floor echoed from behind the courtroom door as the session ended. Quick footsteps, the metallic clatter of handcuffs with every yank, and Raymond Lander's scattered curses blended into a chaotic block of noise pushed out of a space already heavy with tension. As he was dragged through the doorway leading to the courthouse steps, the white glare of the snowy sky struck the furious bruises on his face. The air outside seemed colder the moment he appeared. A barrage of camera flashes erupted at once. The sharp clicks rattled like a shower of metal. A crowd gathered at the bottom of the stairs, reporters pushing against one another for the best angle. Local newspapers knew this would become their biggest headline in months. Several residents stood behind the barricades, their faces caught somewhere between anger and satisfaction as they watched the man who once represented the county's justice system in handcuffs. Lander thrashed, but the two security officers held him tight. He kept twisting his head, his eyes darting wildly, searching for someone to blame. "I'll sue every last one of you," he screamed, his face flushed with rage. "I'll be back, you hear me, I'm coming back." The officers pushed him toward the security van, but his voice carried through the wind. "None of you is getting away with this." The woman who had been his lover and legal advisor walked several steps behind him. She avoided his eyes when he turned his head, and almost instinctively shifted toward the prosecution team, standing closer to them as if cutting the final tie with the man collapsing before her. She wrapped her arms around herself to stay steady, though her shoulders trembled whenever his shouts grew fainter in the distance. At the top of the courthouse steps, Walter Grayson stood beside Daniel Ruiz. Snow wind swept across their faces, throwing fine ice grains that looked like powdered glass. Daniel lifted his coat and gently placed it over Walter's shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low with worry he didn't bother hiding. Walter looked up at the white sky above, his eyes weary from years but shining differently today. He nodded, a simple nod that carried an entire lifetime in it. "Okay," he said, his breath fading pale in the cold air. "Because I finally spoke." Daniel stood next to him, pressing his lips together as if to hold back the emotions swelling after everything they had just endured. A reporter forced her way forward, raising her recorder close to Daniel's face. "Are you afraid of retaliation?" she asked, her voice quick and sharp, eager to catch the heat of someone who had just gone up against an entire system. Daniel looked straight at the device, the bruises still on his face, but his gaze was unwavering. "Afraid," he said without hesitation, "but the truth matters more." His answer made several people nearby lift their heads, as if recognizing that something stronger than simple bravery stood before them. Walter lowered his gaze, reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and took out a small piece of aged metal. It was his old military badge. He turned it in his palm like a reminder of the many lives left behind in wars never written in history books. "That soldier," Walter said, his voice hoarse but clear. "He finally got his name back." Daniel heard the words and felt his throat tighten. He looked at Walter, his eyes sinking into the man who had carried a secret heavier than his own life for decades. "We did the right thing," he said, barely noticing how his voice trembled. The cold wind struck his bruised cheek, sharp with pain, but he ignored it. People leaving the courthouse paused to look at them. Some bowed their heads in a silent greeting toward Walter. Others kept their hands in their pockets against the cold, but their eyes remained fixed on the aging veteran standing on the snowy steps. No one said it aloud, but Walter's presence made them understand that silence was sometimes its own kind of battlefield. Below the steps, the security van's door slammed shut. The loud thud sounded like a final period at the end of a tragedy spanning generations. The vehicle rolled over the white snow, leaving deep tire marks across the frozen road. Lander's shouting faded behind thick glass and disappeared. Winter wind blew harder, lifting the edge of Walter's coat at the shoulder. Daniel held his arm lightly to steady him. The two men stood there a few seconds longer than everyone else, as if their bodies needed time to understand that the confrontation was finally over. The sky opened wide above them, a straight stretch of endless white. Walter drew a long breath, feeling the cold cut through his throat but no longer weighing on him. He touched the badge once more, then tucked it back into his coat pocket, where his heart beat in quiet but steady pulses. Before moving, Walter looked down at the white snow in front of him. He paused, letting his feet feel the hard, frozen ground beneath. Daniel turned to him but didn't ask anything. They both stood in the thin wind, on the wide courtyard still marked with the footprints of dozens of people after the trial. Walter pressed his lips together, then spoke in a low but heavy voice. The last words he had kept for 40 years. "This winter," he said softly, his eyes on the endless white, "won't be silent anymore." The story of Walter Grayson is not only the journey of an old veteran fighting against injustice, but also a reminder of the value of truth in a society easily covered by power and fear. For 40 years, he lived in silence, enduring the pain of a buried secret. Only when he stood up, daring to break that fear, was the truth returned to the one who needed it, and justice finally found its way to appear. The lesson here rises above a trial or a military file. It is a lesson about courage, about how every individual, even when tired, weak, or seemingly insignificant, still has the right to speak up when witnessing something wrong. Silence may help us live peacefully for a moment, but that very silence can kill the most important things: truth, honor, dignity, and the memory of those who have fallen. When watching Walter walk out of the courthouse into the white snow, we understand that there are battles quieter than the battlefield, but no less painful, and everyone will have a moment to ask themselves, if it were me, would I have the courage to speak what is right? If this story makes you reflect, please share it so more people can learn from it and reconsider each individual's responsibility in protecting the truth. Thank you for following along. We are committed to bringing the finest content. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories.